Good evening. Welcome to the Leo Baeck Institute and the Center for Jewish History. My name is Billy Weitzer. I'm the executive director, and I am so pleased that you're all here. For some of you, it's probably your first time here. The Center for Jewish History houses 4 archives and a museum. We are the archive that preserves and promotes the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry. We have a library of 80,000 books. We have 8,000 objects, some of them art, some of them other three-dimensional objects from life in Germany. And we also have 3.5 million documents. Our goal is to maintain the historical records of all of German Jewish history. But our work doesn't stop there. We're committed to public events such as these. And the exhibition, like Stolen Heart, helps us examine the unique perspective of the German Jewish experience and its impact in Germany, in Central Europe, around the world, historically and today. Before I talk about tonight's event, I want to note another event that we're hosting here this Sunday, April 3rd at 2:30 in the afternoon. Some of you may have seen the exhibit that's up here on the floor above in the David Berg Rare Book Room. It's called Burning Words. It's a story of a brave and brilliant Christian scholar named Johannes Reuchlin. In 1511, he wrote a book entitled Augenspiegel that made the case that Jewish books should not be burned. As a matter of fact, he argued that Jewish texts should be actively studied as fundamental to the origins of Christianity. On Sunday, we'll be reading selections from a play that was written about Reuchlin's book, and we will be discussing this remarkable period of history. So, from a debate in 1511 to the Nazi theft of German properties in the 1930s to the present day in Berlin, I hope you have a sense of the breadth of our holdings and the types of events that we hold. I want to, first of all, thank descendants of the 5 families that are highlighted in the exhibition for coming here and being a part of this wonderful opening and sharing their stories in the exhibit. So could you please rise? We are honored that you allow us to remember your families in this exhibition and that many of you have traveled far to be here for the opening. I also want to thank members of our board, our president, Ronald Sobel, board members Joan Lessing and Lee Sander for being here. I want to thank our German representatives. You'll hear shortly from Britta Wagner, the German Consul General, and the Deputy Consul General Kai Hennig is also here. So if Britta Wagner could come up and please say a few words to the group, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Billy Weitzer, dear Ms. Entrader, distinguished descendants and members of families who are represented in the exhibit, dear Professor Harold James, ladies and gentlemen and friends of Leo Baeck Institute. This exhibition, Stolen Heart, was adapted from a larger exhibition, German exhibition, which opened at the Berlin Stadtmuseum in September 2013. The exhibition underscores the largest state-sponsored property rampage of the Jewish population in Berlin during the Nazi reign. Since the Middle Ages, Jewish business and property owners were gradually integrated into city life in Berlin, in particular from the 19th century until the 1930s. We all know that everything changed when the Nazis came to power. Berlin was not only the capital of the Third Reich, but Hitler and his minions like Albert Speer dreamt of making it into the Welthauptstadt Germania. In their megalomania, they sought to convert and misuse Berlin's historic central district for their gigantic and monstrous town planning. In the course of the Aryanization, the Nazis began the state-sponsored Entjudung, or de-Judaization, of Berlin's city center through the creation of laws and measures that in turn expropriated, persecuted, and murdered the Jews. But instead of becoming the metropolis Germania, the city of Berlin was almost completely destroyed during World War II. As of October 1949, Berlin's Mitte, the central area of Berlin, the heart of Berlin, was located within East Germany. What was left over from Berlin's old city center was to a large extent bulldozed away by East German authorities in the mid-60s. Jewish former property owners were not given any compensation. The government in East Germany had no intention of making up for the injustice against the Jewish population under the Nazi regime. It took Germans until the fall of the wall and reunification in 1990 to begin a process of restitution of Jewish properties in East Germany within a complicated legal framework laid down in the Unification Treaty. With German reunification, a new Berlin has grown and developed. At Hausvogteiplatz, which is shown also in the exhibit, a memorial was put up in the year 2000 with mirrors resembling those in fashion houses and apparel shops. And it reminds us of the thriving fashion industry owned by Jewish companies residing around this square. On the steps exiting the subway station to the square, the names of these companies are engraved. When I served in Berlin in the Foreign Office, I took these steps every morning on my way to work, being reminded of the great history of Jewish companies and of what Germans had done to them in the 30s and 40s. It is in our responsibility to maintain the memories of the loss of Jewish life and Jewish property. And I'm convinced that this exhibition will contribute to the remembrance and honor of the heritage of the Jews who lived and worked in Mitte, the heart of Berlin. And I'm very happy, and this I would like to say to conclude, to see a thriving Jewish life in Berlin again these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful synopsis of what's the exhibit is all about. And I hope that many of you, or most of you, got to see it. But of course, it was crowded, so please come back and study it, and you'll learn some of the many lessons that the Consul General just told us about, including about Berlin as a thriving city today. And so we're very proud of the central element of the exhibit that exhibits that. So it's time for me to thank some people, and some of them you know. Many of you were probably invited here by Joanna Trator, who inspired us to bring this exhibit, but the exhibit would not have existed without the work of the three founding curators, Benedikt Goebel, Lutz Mausberger, and Gesa Kessemeyer. Benedikt will join us on a panel later. Of course, the exhibit is beautiful thanks to C&G partners. Many people from C&G are here. We worked most closely with Jonathan Alger and Kelsey Cohn. And of course, the staff of the Leo Baeck Institute. Many people contributed to this: Frank Mecklenburg, Renata Stein, Renata Evers, and our main project person was Elisa Schulman, who many of you probably spoke to before you came to get tickets to this, and we couldn't have done this exhibit without all of you. And last but not least, we have funding from the Sidney Frank Foundation, which allowed us to put together this exhibit, which is the most magnificent exhibit we've ever put together. So, to the main event. We are going to have a talk, and I will introduce our speaker soon, and then a panel. We have passed out note cards because there are some people in overflow in the Great Hall, and we wanted to make sure that everyone's questions had a chance of being asked. We won't be able to ask everybody's questions, but we'll answer and have a good discussion, and it'll be followed by a reception, where of course the conversation can continue. So allow me to introduce Dr. Harold James, Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is the Claude and Laurie Kelly Professor in European Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. where he studies economic and financial history and modern German history. He was educated at Cambridge, where he got his PhD, and came to Princeton in 1986. He's written many books, and most of them are relevant to tonight's topic, but to name a couple, a study of the interwar depression in Germany, the German slump, an analysis of the changing character of national identity in a book called Germany, A German Identity, 1770 to 1990, and a book, The Deutsche Bank and the Nazi Economic War Against the Jews. We are delighted and honored that Professor James has agreed to speak to us on this important occasion.
Thank you, Dr. Weitzer. It's an enormous honor to be here at this inauguration of a, I think, very, very important exhibition with important lessons that we should carry away from this evening. It's very, very moving and fitting that the descendants of the five families whose history is portrayed in part in the exhibition panels upstairs are here with us. It's wonderful in particular that Dr. Intrato, who made an enormous effort to have this exhibition taken from Berlin to show in New York, is here and is going to discuss the exhibition in a few minutes' time. I think it's important to think about the role that property played in the persecution and eventually the annihilation of the Jews in Germany and in Europe. Here upstairs, you can see the map of the center of Berlin, this area, Berlin Mitte. You can see the number of Jewish-owned properties that were there. In the 1930s, the estimation is that of something like 1,200 plots, 300 of them were owned by Jewish people or families who were then expropriated in one way or another by the Nazi dictatorship. And it's striking, I think, and I would like to come back to this at the conclusion, how little of this so far has been restituted. And that's, I think, one of the open questions that the exhibition invites us to think about. So why is property so important? It's in part because the Nazi dictatorship looted property in order to pay for the militarization, the armaments campaign, the preparation for the war of aggression that it launched in 1938 and 1939. But it's more than that. As the Consul General rightly said in the introduction, this was also part of a campaign to rebuild Berlin and to make Berlin into a new city that would reflect the new ideology of National Socialism. And the principal architect of that, Albert Speer, came as General Building Inspector of Berlin and supervised quite a lot of this work of expropriation. It's also a story of individual Nazis benefiting from the expropriation of Jews. Individual Nazis, but also non-Nazis who were well connected with the regime or who wanted to be well connected with the regime and who used those connections in order to steal property. So it's an expropriation, but it also had a role, and I think we should remember that role, in the persecution and eventual destruction of Jewish people. Why? because the Nazis wanted to marginalize Jews. They wanted to steal their property before they emigrated, so that when they were pushed into emigration, they would come with almost nothing. One of the most moving parts of the exhibition in the Jewish Museum in the center of Berlin are 31 keys from the Sommerfeld family. They were the keys with which they locked their luggage when they left for New York at the end of 1938. They arrived, but their luggage never arrived. But property, real estate, is much more fundamental to this story. That's why this exhibition is so important. Because most of the property that German Jews had was not in bank accounts or in securities, but in real estate. The answer why is, I think, quite obvious if you think of the catastrophic financial and economic events that had overshadowed the German history until 1933, the Great Inflation and the Great Depression. So the Great Inflation wiped away money and wiped away bank accounts. And so real estate was really the only way of hanging on to property. If that was expropriated, and then part of the diabolical machination that the Nazi regime used was to put limits that they'd actually inherited already from the governments of the late Weimar Republic in 1931, dealing with a financial crisis. There was a tax imposed on money that was moved abroad. And that tax, devised as a general tax, was quickly, probably even in the Weimar Republic, used as an instrument of targeting Jews. And then after 1933, the tax rates are put up, the intensification of this system of expropriation goes on, and so Jews who are going to emigrate to France or the Netherlands or Switzerland have nothing. And the German government in 1938 and the Nazi Party explicitly said that doing this was a way of making other peoples, other states, think of Jews as worthless human beings. So it had an impact on other countries, and it was designed to have an impact on other countries. It's not the only case of this happening. The Serbian government did this to Albanians in Kosovo, to make Albanians look as if they're beggars and criminals and destitute, and to make sure that people in other states regarded them as such. But the persecution, the expropriation that the Nazis did was quite unique in the extent to which it was designed, explicitly designed, to make other people think of the Jews as penniless and helpless and fundamentally worthless. So telling the story of this expropriation is really, really crucial. And the stories that are represented here, the story of the Gardial family or the Bergler-Sintrator family or the Fuchses or the Freudenbergs or the Panofskis, they represent this history peculiarly well, because it's not only that the property is taken away, and you can follow, if you look at the panels very closely, the ways in which the property is taken away. It's not directly taken away. Sometimes it's done by calling in mortgages, putting preliminary mortgages on property, because it was feared that there might be a possibility that the owners might emigrate, so there are all kinds of preventative measures that are put on well before 1938 and the complete assessment of Jewish property in Germany. And then at the end of 1938, after the anti-Semitic pogrom of the 9th, 10th of November, then the seizing of Jewish assets. But then you can also see on those panels how those properties are going to be used as part of the imposition of Nazi ideology. In one case, as the police headquarters, right next to the central bank building, which is now the foreign ministry that the Consul General mentioned in the introduction. In another case, a clothing and textile work that was used to make Nazi flags and then even to print the yellow stars that were used to identify Jews in public and humiliate Jews in public. I think one of the chapters that this history raises is also the question of restitution. And so I would like to end the brief presentation by talking about another family that could have been represented in this exhibition. So it's a matter that there are many, many victims of this expropriation that could have been represented. And I think for me raises in a particularly interesting way the question of what to do about it after 1945, because that also is an absolutely central issue. So the person I would like to talk about briefly is a man called Georg Thomson, who was the chief executive of one of the large German banks, the Deutsche Bank, in 1932 and 1933, at the moment that Hitler comes to power. He's baptized as a Protestant, but he comes from a long line of rabbis in Wroclaw. His father had briefly tried to be a civil servant in the 1870s, but had found the Prussian civil service full of anti-Semitism and had, as a result, gone into banking. Georg Thomson, the son of this father, of Adolf Salomonsson, in the Deutsche Bank in the early 1930s, looking at the politicization in the Depression and the rise of the radical anti-Semitic Nazi Party, thought that the Nazis might be a threat because they might expropriate property in general, but he always thought that before 1933, that the anti-Semitism was just a kind of verbal bubble that the Nazis propagated in order to win votes. In 1933, he learns very quickly that that's not the case and that the Nazis represent a profound shock. And on the 9th of April 1933, immediately after the first big anti-Semitic boycott in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany, he writes a letter that I find so moving, chilling, and prophetic that I think it should be quoted. He writes to another executive in the bank, "The exclusion of Jews from state service, which has now been accomplished through legislation, raises the question of what consequences this measure, which was accepted as self-evident by the educated classes, will bring for the private sector. I fear that we are only at the beginning of a conscious and planned development which is aimed at the indiscriminate economic and moral destruction of all members of the Jewish race living in Germany. The complete passivity of the classes which do not belong to the National Socialist Party, the lack of any feeling of solidarity on the part of those who have up to now worked in business shoulder to shoulder with Jewish colleagues, the ever more evident pressure to draw personal advantages from the free positions," and he goes on to name the shame of Germany in 1933. he had two big properties in Berlin, one in the center, in the so-called Spreebogen, where the big embassies were, and in part are today, and the Federal Chancellery is today, the Alsenstrasse, number 9, and then another in the west end of Berlin by the lake. Those were forced from him in a way that was very, very similar to the way that is described. Once he starts to move quite a lot outside Germany, a precautionary mortgage is placed on this so that he should pay the flight tax even though he hasn't moved from Germany yet. In 1938, the Inselstrasse, the house in the west of Berlin, is bought by a medical doctor called Theodor Morell, who was Hitler's personal physician. But it's very, very striking that Morell absolutely insisted that this property should be sold to him, not by Thomson, but by Thomson's wife, who was Italian and not Jewish, so that nobody could ever say that he had bought the property from a Jew, so that there's a whole series of camouflages that are put in. So Thomson emigrated. He died in 1957. His widow applied for restitution, and it was denied. Until quite recently, it was really mysterious why it was denied. It was when an article in which I quoted this prophetic letter from the 9th of April 1933 was printed in the German newspaper Die Zeit, that the official who in 1957 had been responsible for denying the restitution case wrote into Die Zeit to explain why he'd done what he did. He said he was intrigued by the case and looked at the documents and then looked at the writings of Georg Thomson, because Georg Thomson was a prolific writer and had written in the 1920s and in the early 1930s as well, very, very patriotic articles. And he'd had those republished in 1933 in the face of the Nazi onslaught in order to demonstrate how patriotic, how German he was. And the official, who was a left-leaning, well-meaning social democrat in the restitution administration, said, well, this was somebody whose political views really made it impossible to be very sympathetic with him. And so on those grounds, he denied the restitution in 1957. And only in 2010 did he think that by doing that in 1957, he had committed an injustice. Why? Because in that time between 1957 and 2010, I think this new sensitivity to the issue of property and restitution, the role that the robbing of property played in the persecution, and the importance of restitution as making good that wrong, became much more important. So there are, I think, two lessons that I would draw from this story. One is a particularly German story, and it's related to the importance of identifying through historical work and through exhibitions such as this the wrongs that were done so that they can be righted in the present. But also, I think there is a story, a lesson, a moral that goes beyond Germany, because today also many millions of people are being driven by war, by persecution, away from their homes and being robbed, and the people who are driving them away are also trying to marginalize them and to make them look as if they're worthless and dangerous and possibly criminal. And in those cases where we see this happening today, I think we have a responsibility to think about the lessons of the past and to apply them to ensure that those individuals who are fleeing from persecution, as German Jews and then Jews from other European countries were fleeing in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, that this story is not repeated. So this is an important lesson for Germany, for the United States, but also for the whole world. And I'm really glad that you here have made it possible to have this exhibition. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor James for those great words and gave us a lot to talk about here. Before we do, let me introduce our two other panelists. I mentioned Dr. Benedikt Goebel before as the co-curator of the original exhibit, Geraubte Mitte, along with Lutz Marsberger and Gesa Kessemeyer. It was at the Stadtmuseum in 2013. Dr. Goebel earned his doctorate from Humboldt University in Berlin with a dissertation on the reconstruction of Berlin's medieval city, and he founded a consultancy that focuses on historical research and urban studies and architecture. Dr. Joanne Intrator is a psychiatrist here in New York who is currently writing a book about her fight for restitution for a building owned by her grandfather, Jacob Intrator. The book will feature sensitively observed portrayals of her family's struggle against the Nazis. And the story of the Intrator Berglas family is featured in Stolen Heart. So I'd like to begin by asking Benedikt to talk about his role as curator of the original exhibit. What inspired you to create this exhibit?
Thank you very much for inviting us this evening to the panel. 5 years ago, in 2011, Lutz Mausberger and I invented the idea for Geraubte Mitte and for Stolen Heart, because my friend Lutz is an architect and I'm an urban historian, and we have a deep interest in the actual development of the Berlin inner city today and in the history. Lutz is running a great private archive of photographs of Berlin Mitte, and so we know a lot about the Nazi time history of Berlin in a city in 2011, but not enough. And we did a lot of research for this exhibition, and we researched all 225 Jewish plots, former Jewish plots in Berlin Mitte, and we did some research. We researched thousands of photographs for the original exhibition, and we chose only 2 dozens of them for the exhibit. But this is the story behind the exhibit.
Can you talk about how you selected the 5 families that you chose to highlight?
It was good luck. We did the research in the German archives about the facts of this depossession, the arendization of the 225 plots, but we didn't know anything about the family fate behind these stories. So we looked around, and one man working in the Jewish Museum in Berlin for Leo Baeck told us, "Oh, did you know Joanne Intrator in New York? Yeah? Her family has this interesting history." So I emailed Joanne some years ago, and this is the way it went.
Well, that's great. Maybe that's a good segue to talk to Joanne, because Professor James did just a good job of talking about some of the larger issues. But Joanne, you obviously have a personal family experience with this, and perhaps you can describe to us some of the pressures on your family as they felt the discrimination and terror increase and the laws that Professor James described, and how it was when it became clear to them that their businesses and properties were going to be lost.
First of all, before I begin that, I just want to thank all of you for being here and just say a couple words. My personal investment in the Stolen Heart exhibit emanates from a lifetime of being affected by and deeply interested in what the Nazis inflicted on Jews. On his deathbed, my father, Gerhard Intrator, asked me, "Are you tough enough yet? Do they know who you are?" In hindsight, it can seem that he was asking me about the then upcoming 9-year restitution battle over 16 Wallstrasse, our family property stolen by the Nazis. To be sure, I endured a lot of ups and downs and severely conflicting emotions in that battle. Yet as a result of it, I got to know many non-Jewish Germans of goodwill who contribute to efforts to make the world a better place. Without such people, this exhibit would never have been possible. You've already heard from the German Consul General in New York, Britta Wagner. I note in passing that between 1994 and 1997, Ms. Wagner served in the German consulate in Tel Aviv. And so I want to personally acknowledge the significance of your presence here, Madam Consul General, and to say, Ich danke Ihnen. I also offer my gratitude to the original curators of this exhibit when it was known as Geraubte Mitte in Berlin, Lutz Mauersberger, Benedikt Goebbels, and Gisa Kassemeyer. Not only are Lutz and Benedikt and Gisa responsible for the exhibit's bedrock scholarship, they contributed generously to this English language iteration of the exhibit. And I'm very excited to have Dr. Harold James here today. The Deutsche Bank and the Nazi economic war against the Jews truly is a landmark in the field. Again, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you all for being here. Now I'll tell you a little bit about my family, okay? I wrote some notes to make it a little bit easier for me. My grandfather could never have predicted the success of the Nazis in his beloved Germany, where he'd come escaping from pogroms to give his children a better life. Jacob Intrator was a patriot. He was a German soldier in World War I and suffered mustard gas injury. Rosa, my grandmother, loved Berlin and the life it offered. Even Hitler marching in front of their home did not daunt her. She was the classic case of a German Jew who thought Hitler would somehow go away. My father, however, was an ardent reader of history, including Mein Kampf, and a keen observer of the street fighting all around him in his Berlin youth between the forerunners of the Nazis and the communists. In 1928, my father told Jacob that he would never be able to practice law in Germany, and Jews had no future there. His father, my grandfather, thought he was unreasonably pessimistic, and my father, a dutiful son, went to Freiburg for his law degree. How ironic it was that my father was the first in the family to feel the blows of the anti-Jewish legislation of April 7th, 1933, barring him from his position in the Berlin municipal courts. Gerhard was not the type of person to tell his father, "I told you so." But by 1935, he arranged with an American uncle to get sponsored with the express aim of getting his parents and the rest of his family out of Hitler's Germany. He waited until 1937 to use the visa, unsuccessfully trying to convince his parents to leave. Rosa and Jacob had already left their home once before, and for a few short years they believed they could survive under Hitler. Though some of Jacob's businesses were soon outlawed, he still had his properties and access to foreign currency that the Nazis prized. But as I read the hundreds of letters between Jacob and Gerhard that I found during the Wallstrasse case, the tension between father and son was there to be seen in the loving lines of a son trying to pry his parents loose. And then there was Jacob's well-founded concern that my father's adjustment to the United States was not as Gerhard had written. By January 1938, my grandfather's letters expressed doubts about his initial optimism. Businesses of his that survived the initial Aryanization fell victim. Rosa was still sure they could survive, yet friends and family left Germany. My grandparents' lives became constricted. It was dangerous for them to be on the streets. Letters would often say, "The view from the balcony is fine." The porter in the building looked after them, but clearly affected by the changes all around her, Rosa nearly died in October of a bleeding ulcer. By the end of 1938, a niece and nephew disappeared. Finally, at the American consulate, which would be shut days at a time, they were told that they wouldn't be allowed to leave before 1946. Ashes were delivered to Rosa from the concentration camp Sachsenhausen. Her nephew was told died of natural causes. All countries were closed to them, but in October 1941, they left Berlin for Cuba, traveling first by train across Europe and then the ocean during the Atlantic War. Finally, in New York, April 1943, my grandfather died the day he arrived. That's it.
Oh, thank you so much for that personal story. It's so interesting to see the larger story that Professor James provides and then the personal story of your family. Professor James, I know you're an expert in some of these economic issues, and you talked about the many ways that the Nazis took properties and monies by law or other ways. Are there any measures of the economic impact of what of what they garnered by their ways?
It's in so many different ways that I think it's really genuinely very, very hard to add them all up. This is a substantial amount of property. That you can see it on the maps that the exhibit lays out upstairs, and these are then used for all kinds of purposes. But it's clearly not the only way in which the Germans financed the war effort, but it's an important part of the preparation. But it also does other things, and I think the exhibition makes that very clear. It's designed for this kind of rebuilding of Berlin that has nothing to do with the war, and it's designed for the enrichment of individuals in the party as well. So it's got all kinds of purposes at the same time. But from my perspective, the idea of making people vulnerable and humiliating them was an important part of the Nazi mindset in this activity, yes.
Well, I'll ask a couple more questions. Are there cards out there that anyone's collected? Just please collect them so we can... Benedict, I asked you a little bit about, you felt you were lucky to pick these families, but Professor James talked about some incredible ironies with the properties that you did highlight, right? The police building, and that's where gas was tested, or the manufacture of yellow stars, or I don't think he did mention the fact that one was used as a warehouse for degenerate art. I mean, was this in your thinking, that these nice contrasts of how these businesses were then turned for other purposes?
No, and in the beginning we have no idea about these horrible coincidences. We have 5 fascinating stories to tell in the exhibit, and some of the stories are mentioned often, but I think I will mention shortly the story of the Gardial Family and their house, Königstraße 50, in front of the town hall. After the Aryanization of this house, some years later, in September 1941, thousands of pieces of art, of modern art, from the degenerate art project of the Nazis were brought to this house of the former house of the Gardial family. And in 1944, this house was ruined by bombing. And these thousands pieces of modern art from the 1920s were destroyed in this building, Königstraße 50. And we didn't know before, but on our years of research, from Gesa to the Freudenberg family and the other 4 families, we got to know these coincidences. And these coincidences are, in our point of view, the reason for these coincidences are the innermost city of Berlin has been the place of action of Jewish life in the Middle Ages. This was the only part of Berlin being built, and in the 16th and 17th century, in good times and in bad times, it all happened. These for pogroms of the Middle Ages, and Moses Mendelssohn, the founder of modern Judaism, he also lived and worked in this inner city of Berlin. And in the 20th century, we have these stories to tell, as you see in the exhibition.
Yeah, well, from what you've said there, I really do encourage people when they get a chance to read through the exhibition to see what you're calling coincidences, what I'm calling irony is the same thing, as well as to see the many different ways that the properties were taken, which Professor James talked about. I mean, it wasn't just one way. There were laws and forced sales and exit taxes, and they're all documented in a variety of ways from the 5 families. A question that I would have for all 3 of you, maybe starting with Professor James, but let's talk a little bit about restitution. We actually plan to have more events related to the exhibition, and one of them would be about restitution, and so we want to take advantage of this exhibit. But from your perspective, Professor James, you told the story about how the sensitivity has changed, and then maybe Benedict will comment, because I know he's really, as we prepared the exhibit, wanted to make sure that we got the message through of how small a percentage of the properties have received any restitution. And then, Joanne, of course, you've got your personal restitution story. So perhaps you want to expand a little bit on the sensitivity issue of how things may have changed and may be more open today.
I think that there is a sensitivity that gradually really came in, not immediately in 1990 with the end of East Germany. It took really a long time to think that a large number of people in Eastern Europe were double victims of Nazism and of communism. And so it's really at the end of the 1990s and in the early 2000s that this new approach begins. But it's clearly very, very difficult in every case, because every property is going to look different. It's not like a homogeneous looting of bank accounts where you can just say what the bank account is and how much can be repaid, because commercial properties and private real estate as well, often have mortgages. So how do you account for the mortgages? Who owns the mortgages? What's the level of debt of a company? Many of these properties were commercially used properties. And all of those kinds of issues make this a kind of legal minefield. So you can see that these are really issues that are going to be fought out in the courts. That restituting property, because in many cases also the property has been confiscated several times, is a much thornier issue than dealing with bank accounts.
Right, and Benedict, I think I learned from you that many of the properties, most of them are really in the hands of government ownership now. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is also because of the innermost city. Normally, all the private Nazis got a big part of the cake, but in the Berlin inner city, it's mostly the German state who was a new owner. Yeah, yeah, it's an very interesting part of the city. And what I would like to say about the Aryanization of real estate is, after the Nazis came to power, it starts the persecution and robbery of department stores starts at least in April 1933, yeah, and it was widely seen, these persecution actions on boycott day of the first days of April, because the Jewish department stores are everybody can see the Jewish department stores, but the owner of real estate is always hidden, yeah, till today and everywhere. So it took some years, and the Nazis robbed the most of the Jewish real estate in 1938, 1939, 1934, and following. And this is invisible to the public. So it's the invisible part of Aryanization is a real estate Aryanization, and it's the last researched Aryanization. The Aryanization of department stores has found some interest in the 1970s and 80s and 90s.
Joanne, do you want to add any comment from your personal restitution battle?
I can say that it was a very complicated process that, as I've mentioned before, lasted over 9 years. It was a kind of a devil's obstacle course, to say the least. Had I not been able to go over to Berlin on numerous times or enlist the help of many people, I don't think I would have gotten anywhere with it. In Berlin and East Berlin in the 90s, many of the people that were involved had worked under the communist regime, and they were the functionaries, bureaucrats that I had to deal with. And there were just, it took a great deal of persistence and belief in what I was doing, both for the memory of my father and father's family and for my son going forward, to maintain the focus that at times was hard to keep.
Well, that's a great preview both for your book and for another exhibition that we'll have. Something happened with our card delivery system. So people have cards, but I think because of time and everything, we're going to just take questions from the audience. Oh, lights, that worked, good. And I think there is a microphone that someone will come get. But we'll take the first question micless, since it's taking us time right here. Yeah. If you can, oh, here comes the mic.
One thinks about it, isn't there a certain irony in the Germans wishing to create a situation in which the memory of the Jewish people would no longer be in existence? At the same time, they wanted their material goods for their own possession. And these were the goods that represented the people they were trying to destroy.
Can we get a question? And I don't know if we can get the mic working or not. No? Questions? Here in the middle, sir. Can you shout? Yeah. Because, yeah.
Try to shout. The Germans looted residences of wealthy Jews, as we now know. And is there any
Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The Germans looted the residences of wealthy Jews, and I wonder, is there any archive of these looted properties, like art, furnishings, antiques, and the like, that may be available so as to find out what happened to these looted properties? Even if one has to go further, the question is, are there any archives? The Germans were meticulous about archives.
Sure. I mean, that's actually a very, very interesting area because, yes, I mean, these things were very, very carefully documented on a local level, but the archives were really only put together and published and studied in a historical way from the 1990s onwards. The pioneer of this kind of archiving of what was taken from individual apartments was, I think, a Hamburg historian called Frank Bayor, but he really publishes this stuff in the 1990s. So up till then, there was absolutely no way of finding out, short of digging in very, very obscure places. And I think also, this is not just a German issue, this is an issue of looting all over Europe because of the German occupation from 1939, 1940. And in many cases with art, governments after the war, the German government, but also other West European governments, just kept the art because they thought that somehow art belonged in the public sphere, even though they didn't exhibit it. So there was a conscious suppression of the knowledge of this until very, very recently.
Comments from your research?
Yeah, there are a lot of information sleeping in the archives, and it's a hard work to get the information out of the archive you want to have. The exception is the art Professor James mentioned. Yeah? There's an online database for some years, looted art, and you can look up easily the looted art, but nothing else. Small database in Berlin for small Jewish business. It also was presented here in the LBI some years ago, but these are small exceptions. The general story is there are a lot of information in the archives, but they will be there for long and unpublished.
With regard to the role that the Jewish Claims Conference played in all of this, can you hear me? Yeah. With regard to the role that the Jewish Claims Conference played in the issue of restitution, would you say, Mrs. Intrator, that they helped you and others in your situation, or did they not have any effect at all?
In the Wallstrasse property, the Jewish Claims Conference held the intrator portion until the descendants, my father and his brother Alex, were found, and they made sure that no one else could take our position. Our names were located on in the Grundbuch, and the Claims Conference held it until we were able to prove that we were the descendants of our grandfather. So they were very helpful in our situation.
One of the main reasons that I've read for the expropriation of Jewish property and Jewish tax and also Jewish taxes was the need to finance rearmament. Taxes did not provide enough money for this project, hence taxing Jews and appropriating their property provided an additional source of monetary source and carried out Nazi and anti-Jewish goals. Could you comment on the connection between the anti-Jewish goals and the need for income, money to run the government?
Well, if I could paraphrase what Professor James said before, felt that a lot of it was for individual gain, you know, and then that it couldn't have fully paid for the Nazi war effort, but there clearly was gain. Is that?
Yes, it's also, I think, the case that, I mean, indeed, in 1938, the Nazi armaments effort was being ramped up, and they couldn't finance it by conventional means, couldn't finance it by taxes, couldn't finance it by borrowing because the market for public debt collapsed. And so it was then, and it was put forward in November 1938 in the aftermath of the pogrom by Hermann Goering, the Minister-President of Prussia. That was an explicit goal of putting the levy on the Jewish people at that time.
Yes. In doing the research for the Wallstrasse restitution case and going through my father's papers, I found dozens of letters between my grandfather and banks that were called Nazi banks. I think they were intermediary banks, like the Hardy Bank. The letters were all signed, you know, with the Nazi insignia on it. But each of these letters systematically eroded the monies of my grandfather, both real estate and whatever else he owned. And every time they would take a percentage for the Jewish tax, there was also an income tax, I believe they paid, and the value of their real estate continued to deteriorate until it was worthless. The other part of my grandfather's experience was the fact that he had a business in Romania and was able to get foreign currency, which was extremely valuable to the Nazis in their war effort. So they kept that aspect of my grandfather's business alive a little bit longer in the goal of getting foreign currency.
I wanted to mention two things. First of all, there is a film which appeared a few years ago called Menschliches Versagen, which really shows how what you might call ordinary Germans came into going to auctions where property that had just been confiscated from Jews were available, and all the items were recorded and listed, and who bought them and how much they paid for them and so forth. So indeed, it was a way of incorporating the general German population in the process of exploiting the Jews. And it's, I think, quite a striking description of that. And the film is called Menschliches Versagen, and in English, I think the best translation is one given by my father, which is not given by the usual English translation, and that is Humanity Denied. And the other thing I wanted to mention, we were talking before about coincidences when properties that had been confiscated from Jews were then used for various purposes, such as storing confiscated art. And where else could you have put them? I don't think it was a coincidence at all. That's what was available as a place to put all these things. So it was really all part of the same mindset and the same pattern, I think.
Thank you. So you're saying not exactly a coincidence because these were the buildings that were available. Let's take a couple more questions, and then, as I said, we'll be able to continue the conversation out in the back, in the auditorium, in the Great Hall.
This question is for all the panelists, but primarily for Professor James. There's been much debate in the last 5 years over the growth of anti-Semitism in Europe, and specifically in Germany. I think in 2013, the Berlin Senator for Labor, Senator Collett, had said that of 8 anti-Semitic incidences in Germany, 7 came from the far right, meaning that it was not the result of foreign influence or Muslim immigrants. So my question really is, to what extent would prevailing notions of anti-Semitism have played a role in denying restitution to claims in the 50s? And to what extent might there be an undercurrent of anti-Semitism today that might have impacted recent decisions or the lack of progress in restitution? So I know it's a complicated question, but I think it's an important one as we evaluate the continued existence of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
It's a very, very important question. I think there's no doubt about this. For long periods of the post-war history of Germany, actually on both sides of the war, but in East Germany particularly, because in the 1950s, in the last year of Stalin's life, anti-Semitism became almost a standard bit of the East German intellectual armament, and then there were continuous campaigns against Zionism that the Soviets put forward. But it is true in West Germany as well that many of the people who were involved in the looting of the Jews are then in important positions. So I think the exhibit he talks about this quite clearly, that the deputy of Albert Speer as the general building inspector of Berlin is somebody called Hetlager, who is quite a prominent official in the 1950s and 1960s. I wouldn't think, though, that this is something that is really impacting decisions in the 1990s and the 2000s anymore. The kind of anti-Semitism you're talking about is the anti-Semitism of the radical right, and it's to be found in Germany and other European countries. It may be on the increase, but it's not an anti-Semitism that is part of the position of the German government or of judicial authorities, to my knowledge or to my awareness.
It is an interesting question about the echoes of history to today and different forms of anti-Semitism, and also to acknowledge the professor's comment about marginalization of others and forced migration, and today, and even to go that to the current event of not just anti-Semitism but the reverse, where the Germans feel a responsibility, and Angela Merkel felt a responsibility to take in 1 million refugees last year. So there are some very complex questions that don't just come from comparisons of years past, but perhaps the influence of years past to what's going on today in Europe.
Hi. Anti-Semitism or realistic complications aside, I mean, I've heard the lecture. I still don't understand. The wall came down in 1990. The Merkel government is very pro-West and pro-restitution. And only 5% of properties have been restituted to survivors or their descendants. I mean, it sounds outrageous to me. Why, if the government controls or owns a lot of these properties, just get it done. I mean, I'm not understanding the delays and the complications. Just it's Jewish stolen property that the government has some control in returning or restituting. Like the normal laws and complications and slow court battles should be put aside. I don't get it.
No, you're right. I think it's shamefully slow.
It's absolutely insufficient or horribly this non-restitution of Jewish property after the wall came down. And in our point of view, anti-Semitism played a big role behind the scenes. It's my point of view. But these 5% of restitution, the reason is, after 1990, in the inner city of Berlin, nearly all buildings has been destroyed. And the cases of restitution are nearly only possible if the building still exists. 95% of the buildings are destroyed, and in all these cases of former Jewish plots property, restitution is out of the question because of their streets paved, built, and all sorts of green, not only parks, and it's impossible by this Vermögensgesetz from 1994 to give back this property, unbuilt plots. Yes, good point. Yeah, the first one is restitution is only possible, nearly only possible, if the building still exists. The second case is compensation, and compensation, this is absolutely insufficient. Is paid after hard struggle for justice, like Joanne and a lot of others did. It should be the other way around. The German state has to argue we paid the fair price in the 1930s, 40s, but the descendants have to fight hard for years to find in the archives the letters they need for justice. This is totally wrong. And after this, the descendants won their fights. We have the big problem of the measurement of compensation. The compensations were paid by the tax value of properties in Berlin in 1935, or Germany in 1935. This is the lowest tax price in German history, and it just was doubled. But the prices of 1935 are absolutely inadequate for the years of 1995, 2000, 2005, when the compensations were paid. So in our estimation, the paid compensations are 5% till maximum of 10%, from 2016 at maximum 3 or 5% of the real value of the real estate today. This is absolutely insufficient.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, Benedict's pointing to a lot of hurdles, and I've learned a lot from him and his colleagues, and that is really the purpose of this exhibition. First of all, to remember the families that lost their properties, but then to move forward and to look at the descendants who are fighting for some form of compensation and restitution. And with that, I'd like to close this because we are going to talk about restitution in future programming about the exhibit. I encourage you to come back and view the exhibit, and I also hope you'll stay for some wine and cheese and we'll continue to answer your questions. So thank you all so much for being here.